There's a reason your grandfather never talked about the war. Not all of it, anyway. He'd tell you about D-Day, about Iwo Jima, about the Code Talkers who saved thousands of lives. But there were other men, Apache men, who fought in a different kind of war. One without bullets, without battles anyone would recognize. A war fought in the spaces between heartbeats, in the moment before you realize you're not alone in the dark. And those men, they never came home. Not really. What if the most decorated unit in American military history was never acknowledged because what they did to the enemy's mind was considered more dangerous than any weapon we've ever built? What if those warriors, men who made entire battalions surrender without firing a shot, who left enemy soldiers dead from terror alone, were buried in classified files not to protect national security, but to hide what we're capable of becoming in war? Before we reveal what's hidden in the restricted archives of Fort Huachuca, in the burned file sections of the National Personnel Records Center, and in the oral histories that Apache elders still refuse to share with outsiders, you need to understand how it began. Before we dive into this story, subscribe and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. If you're fascinated by the tactical innovations and psychological warfare techniques that decided battles in World War II, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. We bring you the untold stories of ordinary soldiers who achieved extraordinary results through ingenuity and courage. Don't miss our upcoming videos on the hidden tactics that changed history. On the morning of December 8th, 1941, 23 hours after Pearl Harbor's smoke still hung over the Pacific, a telegram arrived at the San Carlos Apache Reservation in Arizona. The paper was standard War Department issue. The cipher was military grade. But the message inside violated every protocol the Army had for civilian contact. It demanded the immediate presence of tribal elders at Fort Huachuca for what it described only as matters of ancestral knowledge and national survival. By nightfall, 12 Apache elders had made the journey through the winter desert to the military installation. They traveled in silence, watching the stars, sensing something in the urgency of the summons that went beyond war. One elder later told his grandson, "We knew before we arrived that the Army wanted something from the old days, something that should have stayed buried with our grandfathers." What happened in that meeting would be expunged from every official record. The only evidence it occurred at all is a single document fragment discovered in 2003. A requisition form for cultural consultants, dated December 9th, 1941, with every name redacted. The conference room was underground, windowless, lit by harsh fluorescent tubes that hummed against the concrete ceiling. Seated across from the elders were 4 men in Army uniforms. No name tags, no unit insignias, nothing that could identify them later. The highest-ranking officer, a colonel the Apaches would refer to only as the man with dead eyes, had a sealed folder in front of him that he never opened during the entire meeting. "Gentlemen," the colonel began, his voice carrying the exhaustion of a man who'd been awake since the bombs fell. "What I'm about to propose will never appear in any history book. It will be classified beyond top secret, beyond even the levels we're using for our work on the atomic bomb. If you agree to help us, you'll be training warriors to become something this world hasn't seen since your ancestors fought against the cavalry in these mountains. You'll be creating psychological weapons, human weapons, ghosts that walk through enemy lines and destroy them from the inside out." The tribal chairman, Joseph Tio Seco, a man who'd fought in the Apache Wars as a young scout, stared at the colonel for a full minute before speaking. His response, preserved only in a single declassified intelligence memo that surfaced decades later, was a warning wrapped in agreement. Our grandfathers knew how to make an enemy see spirits in the darkness, hear death in the wind. If you want us to teach your soldiers those ways, you need to understand the price. When a man learns to move like smoke, to kill like a hunting cat, to live in his enemy's nightmares, he cannot return to being a man who sleeps in peace. This knowledge breaks something inside. It does not heal. What the military was requesting went far beyond the Navajo Code Talkers, who would later receive public recognition and congressional medals. This was something else entirely. Something that would never be honored, never be spoken about in memorial services. This was about taking ancient Apache guerrilla warfare, psychological tactics refined over centuries of survival, and weaponizing them with modern military technology, hallucinogenic compounds, acoustic devices, orchestrated terror campaigns designed to make entire units believe they were fighting supernatural forces. The program was never given an official name. In the fragmented documents that researchers have painstakingly assembled from burned files, redacted memos, and oral testimonies, it's referred to only as the Ghost War Program or the Shadow War Initiative. By January of 1942, the first wave of volunteers arrived at a newly constructed training facility hidden in a box canyon 40 miles northeast of Fort Huachuca. The location was chosen with deliberate precision. It was ancestral Apache hunting ground, a place where the rocks still held the memory of raids and warfare. The military wanted the trainees immersed in that history, wanted them to feel their warrior ancestors watching from the canyon walls. 147 Apache men reported for training. Only 63 would ever reappear in any military documentation. The others simply vanished from the official record. Their enlistment papers exist. Their training rosters are stamped and filed. But after March of 1942, they ceased to exist in any database, any pension record, any casualty report. Their families received identical telegrams. Transferred to classified theater, no further information available. No bodies were ever returned. No death certificates were ever issued. Tribal oral history refers to them simply as the ones the ghosts took. The training that took place in that canyon over 6 brutal months has been described in fragmentary testimonies as unlike anything the American military had attempted before or since. The men learned to move through terrain without disturbing dust, to track by changes in air pressure and shadow angles, to survive for weeks behind enemy lines with no supplies, no extraction plan, no hope of rescue. And then came the psychological component, the part that would break most of them. A journal recovered from Lieutenant Robert Chen, one of only 2 non-Apache officers permitted to observe the training, was found in his effects after his suicide in 1997. An entry dated March 14, 1942, reads, "Today I watched them demonstrate what the elders call the fear walk. It's the art of stalking an enemy position for hours, moving just close enough to be sensed but never seen. Rearranging objects, creating sounds that have no source, making grown men believe they're being hunted by something that doesn't exist. I watched a seasoned sergeant break down sobbing after only 20 minutes. He said he felt something breathing on his neck, heard whispers in a language he didn't understand, saw shadows that moved against the light. When it was over, the Apache instructor looked at me and said, 'This is the gentle version. Wait until you see what we do when we add the fear compounds and the sound machines.' I'm beginning to understand why this program will never be acknowledged. Because if the American people knew what we're creating in this canyon, if they knew we were turning men into instruments of psychological torture, they'd demand we shut it down. But we won't, because it works. And in war, that's all that matters." What Lieutenant Chen witnessed was only the beginning. Within months, these ghost warriors would be deployed to the Pacific Theater, where they would achieve results that even hardened military commanders would describe as impossible and terrifying. But the true cost of the program wouldn't become clear until the men, those who survived, began returning home. Or rather, until the things that had once been men began returning. This structure mirrors your competitor's flow exactly while using your unique Apache story material. The hook creates immediate tension. The introduction builds dread through concrete details, and it ends on a cliffhanger that transitions naturally into your Chapter 1 training sequence. The box canyon they chose had walls that rose 300 feet on all sides. A natural amphitheater where sound behaved strangely. Whispers carried for hundreds of yards. Footsteps echoed in patterns that made it impossible to determine their source. Apache hunting parties had used this place for generations, precisely because of these acoustic properties. Now the military would use them to teach men how to become auditory phantoms. The training began simply enough. Each recruit was required to move through a bed of dried leaves without producing a single sound. Most failed for days. The Apache instructors would demonstrate crossing 20 feet of brittle vegetation in complete silence, then force the trainees to repeat the exercise until their feet bled. Those who couldn't master it by week 2 were removed from the program. No one knew where they went. Night navigation training stripped away every modern comfort. Recruits were blindfolded, driven into the desert, and abandoned with no water, no compass, no supplies. They had to find their way back using only the smell of creosote. The pressure changes in the air before dawn, the position of stars through the blindfold's weave. Some took 3 days to return. Others were found wandering, delirious, speaking to ancestors who weren't there. Then the scientists arrived. They came in unmarked vehicles, carrying equipment that looked more like torture devices than military technology. Low-frequency acoustic generators that produced sounds below human hearing, but triggered primal panic responses. Aerosol compounds derived from peyote and datura that induced waking nightmares. Strobe devices synchronized to human brainwave patterns that caused temporal disorientation. The demonstrations were clinical. Scientists would dose a volunteer, usually a captured German POW borrowed from a camp in Texas, and have the Apache trainees practice the fear walk while the subject experienced chemically induced terror. The results were documented in meticulous detail. Heart rate spikes, stress hormone levels, the precise moment psychological breakdown occurred. Lieutenant Chen's journal from April 3, 1942, captures the growing unease. 3 more men disappeared last night. The official report says they were transferred to Fort Benning. But I heard the screaming around 0300 hours. I heard them begging to be let out of the canyon. This morning, their bunks were empty, their gear gone, and no one will acknowledge they ever existed. The ones who remain are changing. They move differently now, too quietly, too fluidly. Yesterday, I watched Private Whitefeather stalk a jackrabbit for 2 hours without the animal ever sensing his presence. When he finally caught it, he snapped its neck with a precision that looked almost ceremonial. We're creating something effective, but I'm no longer certain we're creating soldiers. We might be creating something we won't be able to control. In August 1943, 2 Apache operatives were inserted into the Philippine jungle near Leyte. Their names appear in no mission briefing, no after-action report. Military researchers refer to them only as Subject 7 and Subject 12, based on their training cohort numbers. Their target was a Japanese supply convoy, scheduled to move through a mountain pass at dawn. Standard protocol would have been an ambush, quick, violent, decisive. But this wasn't a standard operation. The Apaches began 3 miles out. just after sunset. They used mirror flashes, brief, seemingly random glints of light that appeared and disappeared in the jungle canopy. The Japanese sentries noticed, but couldn't identify the source. Radio chatter intercepted later that night reveals growing confusion. Lights in the trees, no pattern. Could be reflection from water, but there is no water there. At midnight, the whistle started. Not the sharp blast of a signal whistle, but something else. Low, haunting calls that mimicked jungle birds that didn't exist in the Philippines. The sounds came from different directions simultaneously, as if the forest itself had developed a voice. Japanese soldiers began firing into the darkness at shadows that weren't there. By our 200 hours, Subject 7 had infiltrated the convoy's perimeter. He rearranged equipment with surgical precision. Rifles moved exactly 3 inches from where they'd been placed. Canteens turned upside down, photographs of families repositioned to face away. Small changes designed to create the impression of an invisible presence moving through their camp. Subject 12 deployed the acoustic device at 0330. The low-frequency pulse, inaudible but viscerally felt, triggered the fear response the scientists had perfected in the canyon. Combined with the hallucinogenic compound released upwind, the effect was catastrophic. When U.S. forces reached the convoy at dawn, they found 23 Japanese soldiers dead. 7 from self-inflicted gunshot wounds, 11 from apparent heart failure, 5 with no visible cause of death, just expressions of absolute terror frozen on their faces. The survivors, found huddled and catatonic, kept repeating the same phrase. The jungle devils came. They sang to the dead. No shots had been fired by American forces. No direct combat had occurred. Colonel Harrison's classified memo to Pacific Command, dated August 19, 1943, betrays deep unease. Results exceed all projections. Enemy neutralized without engagement. However, our operatives returned in deteriorating mental condition. Subject 7 refuses to speak except in Japanese phrases he claims not to remember learning. Subject 12 will not sleep indoors and has begun scarification rituals, not part of his cultural tradition. Recommend psychological evaluation before redeployment. The recommendation was ignored. The program had proven its effectiveness. The cost to the men wielding it was deemed acceptable. December 1944. The Ardennes Forest. While the Battle of the Bulge raged across Belgium, 3 Apache operatives were quietly inserted behind German lines. The official record states no special operations occurred in that sector. The official record is incomplete. The forest that winter was a nightmare landscape. Trees shattered by artillery, snow stained with frozen blood, a silence so complete it felt like the earth itself was holding its breath. It was perfect terrain for psychological warfare. Sound carried differently in the cold. Shadows moved strangely through the skeletal trees. Fear already saturated the air. The 3-man team, designated only as Unit Ghost in fragmentary documents, spent 2 days circling a Wehrmacht platoon dug into defensive positions. They never showed themselves. They simply made their presence felt. First came the rearrangements. German sentries would find their rifles moved during their watch, positioned to aim back at their own foxholes. Personal items disappeared and reappeared in impossible locations. A soldier's photograph, kept in his breast pocket, would be found nailed to a tree 30 yards away. Then the sounds began. War cries in a language none of the Germans recognized, echoing through the forest from multiple directions simultaneously. The crack of branches that suggested movement, but no figures ever appeared. Whispers in the darkness that seemed to come from inside the soldiers' own helmets. On the third night, Unit Ghost deployed the full arsenal. Acoustic devices hidden in the trees produced subsonic frequencies that triggered panic. Hallucinogenic compounds released upwind caused mass visual distortions. And the Apaches themselves, wearing modified camouflage and bone ornaments, moved through the German position in a coordinated fear walk, visible for only seconds at a time, always at the edge of firelight, always just human enough to be recognized, but inhuman enough to be terrifying. German radio transmissions, preserved in intercepted communications, document the collapse. We are under attack by, we don't know what they are. They move like shadows. They wear bones and skins. They're singing. God help us, they're singing and we can't see them. By dawn, 37 Wehrmacht soldiers had surrendered to shadows. They emerged from their positions with hands raised, weapons abandoned, begging to be taken prisoner by anyone human. U.S. command immediately sealed every document related to the incident. No medals were issued, no after-action reports were filed. The German soldiers were listed as surrendered under standard combat conditions. But the Apache operatives came back different. One spoke fluent German in his sleep, a language he'd never studied. Another couldn't remember his own name for 3 days. The third refused to be photographed, claiming he could see the dead standing behind everyone. The ghosts they'd created in others were beginning to haunt them. By early 1945, the psychiatric wards at Fort Huachuca were operating beyond capacity. The official diagnosis for most patients was combat fatigue or acute stress reaction. The reality was far more disturbing. Medical reports, partially declassified in 2007, document symptoms unlike anything doctors had seen in conventional combat veterans. Operatives experienced profound dissociation, staring at their own hands as if they belonged to strangers, unable to recognize their reflections. Some would slip into trance states mid-conversation, their eyes tracking invisible movements across empty rooms. The sleepwalking incidents were the most alarming. Guards reported finding operatives miles into the desert at dawn, barefoot and unresponsive, arranged in circular patterns as if performing ceremonies they couldn't consciously remember bound. One man was discovered at the edge of the canyon training site, standing motionless for hours, whispering tactical information in Japanese to no one. Others exhibited violent dissociative episodes. A decorated operative attacked 3 MPs, claiming they were enemy spirits wearing American faces. Another barricaded himself in the chapel, convinced that every shadow contained hostile forces. All were subdued, sedated, and quietly transferred. The transfers led to facilities that didn't appear on any official map. Colleagues referred to them as recovery camps, though no one ever recovered. Families received letters stating their sons were receiving specialized treatment for service-related conditions. Visiting was not permitted. Duration of treatment was indefinite. Then came Private Whitefeather's complete breakdown. Search teams found him 30 miles into the Sonoran Desert, half-clothed and severely dehydrated, walking in precise geometric patterns, while chanting in a mixture of Apache, Japanese, and German. When they tried to bring him back, he fought with terrifying efficiency, as if his training had become his only remaining instinct. "The ancestors are calling from the star paths," he told the psychiatrist later, his eyes focused on something beyond the room's walls. "They're angry we used the old ways for this. The ghosts we made, they're not just in the enemy. They're inside us now. We let them in, and they won't leave." In Washington, a classified meeting convened. Some officers argued for immediate shutdown. The program was destroying its own operatives faster than it destroyed the enemy. Others pushed for escalation. The war wasn't over. The results were undeniable. The debate lasted 4 hours. The program continued. Effectiveness, they decided, outweighed the human cost. It always does in war. By summer, new recruits were already arriving at the canyon. The ghosts needed replacements. The program officially ended in 1945. The files were sealed. The survivors were scattered to distant VA facilities or returned to reservations with strict non-disclosure agreements backed by threats of treason charges. Officially, it ended. In reality, it went dormant, waiting. When North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel in June 1950, certain officers remembered what had worked in the previous war. By October, as Chinese forces poured across the Yalu River, the program was quietly reactivated under a new designation: Operation Night Ghost. This time they expanded recruitment beyond Apache warriors. Comanche trackers, whose ancestors had terrorized the Great Plains, were brought into the fold. The training was accelerated. 6 months compressed to 8 weeks. The psychological screening that had been implemented after the WWII breakdowns was quietly abandoned. Speed mattered more than stability. The Korean mountains provided ideal terrain. Fog rolled through valleys like living things, so thick soldiers couldn't see 10 feet ahead. Echoes bounced between peaks in disorienting patterns. Winter winds carried sounds for miles, making it impossible to determine their origin. The operatives used these conditions with devastating precision. Chinese unit commanders reported phenomena their soldiers couldn't explain, figures that appeared on ridge lines and vanished before anyone could fire. War cries that seemed to come from inside the mountain itself. Entire patrols that swore they were being followed by shadows that left no footprints in the snow. Interrogation records from captured Chinese soldiers obtained through intelligence channels and partially declassified in 1998 describe encounters that defy conventional military logic. One sergeant testified, "We saw them on the rocks above us. 5 warriors, painted for war. We fired. Every man in the platoon fired. But when we climbed up, there was nothing. No bodies, no blood, no tracks. They had vanished into the stone itself." The technology had evolved. New acoustic devices didn't just produce fear-inducing frequencies. They simulated footsteps, voices, entire phantom units moving through the darkness. Improved chemical compounds caused targeted hallucinations that lasted hours. The psychological operations had been refined into a precise science of terror. But U.S. command had learned from the previous war's mistakes. No documentation was kept. No medals were awarded. The missions were never recorded in official after-action reports. Officers feared what would happen if word reached the press, if Congress discovered that psychological warfare programs banned by international convention were operating under American oversight. The operatives themselves were designated detached special observers, a bureaucratic classification that made them functionally invisible in military records. They fought a war that would never be acknowledged, and like their predecessors, they began to break under the weight of what they'd become. Vietnam would become the program's darkest evolution. If Korea had been a testing ground for refined techniques, the Mekong Delta was where those techniques crossed into something that couldn't be called warfare anymore. It was orchestrated psychological annihilation. The jungle environment was perfect. Dense canopy filtered light into perpetual twilight. Humidity carried sound in unpredictable ways. The constant noise of insects, birds, and flowing water created an auditory chaos that could mask anything or amplify it. Shadows moved differently here, seeming to have weight and intention. In March 1968, a Marine patrol discovered an entire Viet Cong company near the Cambodian border. 47 men, positioned in defensive formation, all dead. There were no bullet wounds, no shrapnel damage, no signs of chemical weapons. The only marks on the bodies were scratches, self-inflicted, clustered around their own throats and eyes, as if they'd been trying to claw something away that no one else could see. Their faces told the story. Every expression was frozen in primal terror, mouths open in screams that had died with them, eyes one and staring at something the living couldn't perceive. The Marine lieutenant's report mentioned one additional detail before it was classified and redacted. At the tree line, approximately 200 meters from the site, one of my men observed a single figure, human silhouette, moving through vegetation without disturbing it. When challenged, the figure turned briefly, described as wearing tribal markings but wrong, like they'd been carved too deep, then disappeared into the jungle. Pursuit was unsuccessful. No tracks found. Operation Heritage Thunder was never officially acknowledged. It existed only in whispered conversations between intelligence officers, in budget line items labeled Indigenous Reconnaissance Enhancement, in the nightmares of the few conventional soldiers who'd glimpsed its operatives in the field. Internal CIA memoranda from 1969, obtained through FOIA requests decades later with most content redacted, reveal growing alarm. Subject deterioration rate now exceeds 90% within 6 months of deployment. Operatives report temporal disorientation, identity fragmentation, and complete inability to distinguish mission parameters from hallucinatory states. Recommendation: immediate program suspension. The response from MACV Command was classified at the highest levels. Heritage Thunder continuation is critical to pacification efforts. Increase psychological screening for new recruits. Reduce operational duration to 4 months maximum. Maintain absolute operational security. Public disclosure would create diplomatic and legal catastrophe. The program didn't just continue, it went deeper. Funding was buried in classified budgets. Training moved to locations that appeared on no map. The operatives became ghosts in truth, erased from records while still breathing. They'd created warriors who could destroy the enemy's mind. They'd forgotten to ask whether those warriors could keep their own. The Cold War ended. The Berlin Wall fell. Wars became conflicts and peacekeeping operations. But certain budget lines never disappeared. They just evolved better camouflage. A forensic accountant working for the Government Accountability Office noticed them in 2003. Recurring allocations buried in Defense Department black budgets with designations that made no operational sense. Heritage Warrior Continuation, 2.3M. Night Ghost Personnel Support, $890K. And in the 2019 budget, a line item that made her blood run cold. Project Apache Thunder, Personnel Recovery and Containment, 4.7M. Personnel recovery, not retrieval of remains. Recovery of living personnel, containment. She submitted her findings through proper channels. The report was classified within 48 hours. She was reassigned to agricultural subsidy auditing and reminded of her security clearance obligations. But the signs were visible to those who knew where to look. On Apache and Comanche reservations across the Southwest, tribal councils dealt with a recurring phenomenon. Men appearing who claimed to be veterans, sometimes carrying military IDs from decades past, but whom no one recognized. They spoke with fractured memories, mixing English with languages they shouldn't know, describing battles that never officially occurred. Some couldn't remember their own names, but could recite combat coordinates with photographic precision. Families occasionally identified them. Fathers, uncles, brothers who'd disappeared into military service 40 or 50 years earlier and were presumed dead. But the men who returned weren't the men who'd left. They moved wrong, spoke in patterns that felt rehearsed, looked at their own relatives as if viewing strangers through a scope. Independent researchers began connecting fragments. A historian specializing in Native American military service noticed gaps in enlistment records, patterns of disappearances across multiple conflicts. An investigative journalist obtained partially burned documents from a warehouse fire at Fort Huachuca, revealing training curricula that read like psychological warfare manuals combined with anthropological studies of terror. Oral histories became crucial. Apache elders, speaking only off record, described the shadow warriors their grandfathers had warned about, men who'd learned the old ways for dark purposes and could never fully return. Some tribes maintained vigils at certain canyon sites, leaving offerings for those who walk between worlds. Each thread led to more classified walls, more redacted documents, more officials who claimed no knowledge. The pattern was clear. Someone wanted this history to remain buried. The question that haunted researchers wasn't whether the program had existed. The evidence was undeniable. The question was whether it had ever truly ended, or if it had simply learned to hide better. And if those budget lines still existed, if personnel were still being recovered and contained. What exactly was being contained, and why? In 2017, a congressional subcommittee on military intelligence oversight held a closed-door session. No minutes were published, no testimony was recorded for public record. But sources present described a 3-hour presentation of fragmentary evidence. Burned documents, psychological evaluations, budget anomalies spanning 70 years, and testimony from researchers who'd spent decades reconstructing what the government had tried to erase. The conclusion was unanimous and quietly devastating. The Ghost War program had existed, had operated across multiple conflicts, and had destroyed nearly everyone it touched. No action was recommended. The legal implications were too vast. The diplomatic fallout too unpredictable. Instead, the subcommittee authorized a public ceremony. In November 2017, Apache Code Talkers were honored at the Capitol with congressional gold medals. The event celebrated their communication work, the unbreakable codes that had saved countless lives. Speeches praised their patriotism and sacrifice. Not a single word mentioned the shadow warriors, the psychological operations, the men who'd become weapons and couldn't become human again. The families knew. They always had. Off-record testimonies gathered by tribal historians revealed generational trauma that never healed. A granddaughter described finding her grandfather's journal, filled with entries in 3 languages, describing missions that officially never happened. A nephew spoke of an uncle who returned from Vietnam and spent 30 years living in a canyon, unable to sleep indoors, whispering to ancestors in the darkness. "They took our warriors and made them into ghosts," one elder said. Then they were surprised when the ghosts couldn't find their way home. In the spring of 2018, Apache elders performed a ceremony at the original Box Canyon training site. They built fires, offered tobacco, and sang the old songs, not to celebrate, but to acknowledge. To finally speak the names of those who walk between worlds, caught forever between the warriors they'd been and the weapons they'd become. The program achieved its objective. Enemy units collapsed without firing shots. Battles were won through terror rather than bloodshed. By every tactical measure, it was successful. But success demanded a price paid in shattered minds, erased identities, and families left with half-truths and sealed records. History buried the program not from malice, but from a darker truth. Acknowledging it would mean confronting what we're willing to do to human beings in the name of victory. The final question remains unanswered and terrifying in its implications. Those budget lines still exist. Those techniques are documented and preserved. The knowledge of how to create psychological weapons from human beings sits in classified archives. If the ghosts were created once, could they be created again? And would anyone know until the shadows started moving?